Thank you for watching Lore of the Game, Dead by Daylight. Basically, I wanted to make this video mainly because of the lore that's behind this game made by Behavior Interactive. The lore that's in this particular video has been confirmed either by the game itself, developer interviews, and also from the Dead by Daylight wiki. I'll include links and information in the description down below in case you want to research and look at your own opinion. So let's look over the setting, the entity, and all the realms related to Dead by Daylight. We start in the setting of the world across time and space. You can honestly look at your own modern day setting, and based on the aesthetics and the survivors that are included, the Dead by Daylight setting takes place around this time. However, because the fact that other survivors and other killers from across time and even across stories and myths have also been included, we can surmise that the setting is actually pretty far across space throughout time. Evil or darkness always spans through across different parts and facets. The entity, although otherwise known as the Ancient One, is apparently a malevolent being that ensnares and revives those with killer potential or strength of hope in order to even break that hope. The entity itself feeds on fear, hopelessness. While some survivors themselves instill in a lot of fear and hopelessness, there are other survivors that actually thrive on the particular setting that they're brought into versus their real life, as most survivors generally have a major conflict that has yet to be completed, fixed, corrected, and still lives even through the trials today. The entity loves these survivors as it feeds off that emotional change and balance. At the same time, the entity itself loves to grab survivors that have either been killed with a nice revive to be brought into the entity's realm. In some cases, the entity also resides in the wooded areas of where the darkness and sometimes the light never seems to shine. This case can be identified with the case of the survivor Kate Denson, while others that were either killed and then revived by the entity for its constant feeding of emotions is from Bill Overbeck from the Left 4 Dead series. During the sacrifice that he made in order for others to survive, Bill was revived and brought into the world of the entity. With killers, not so much, and a little different than survivors. The entity tends to ensnare those and either help those at its lowest point. One could be found with the legion of those children that ensnared from the woods to be brought in as one of its right hand of the entity. The entity also rescues those killers close to the end, which is highlighted also from Freddy Krueger, as he was close to being either destroyed in its own particular realm that is created of the dream state and dream realm. When the entity brings a killer and a survivor into its realm, it immediately drops them into a pocket of its own trials. It creates a construct from something very powerful that no one really knows anything about, close to what we like to call the base. Killers and survivors would then be first teleported to their first trial, really without any backward knowledge of what had happened and how they got there. And this is usually the freshest moment for the entity to actually feed upon the emotions from the survivor and the killer, as this is the purest form of the emotions that it feels. During the trial, the killer is brought into its own area that is very strong to them, and pretty much a home field advantage. However, at the same time providing the items and also mystical generators of allowing the survivors to survive if they can get those generators online and kicking so that the exits can be opened. Depending on the result of the trial, will require a few different things for both the killer and the survivor. However, the ultimate resolve is not really super important to the entity, as it thrives off the emotional and actions placed from the killers and survivors. If survivors help out and do wonderful things in order for them to actually survive and get out of the trial, they are then rewarded with blood points versus the emotional high that the entity feels. And the same goes with the killers that are able to perform an immense feats of strength and killing potential, where they are also provided blood points in order to be further improved on their skills and usage of abilities. Survivors killed during these trials are usually revived with their memory wiped of the killing and brought back to their normal initial state, other than with the knowledge of knowing what they've performed, how they performed it, and also the killer that was stalking them during the last trial. This ensures that they can continue to improve themselves with their abilities, as well as any items that have been provided, and this could be in the form of an offering, or could also be in the form of anything else that's offered and provided from the entity. Killers also line based on the amount of survivors that are sacrificed, killed, or even let go in most cases. Killers are then teleported after the trial ends, and memory is somewhat wiped other than the survivors that they have sacrificed or killed in order to bring on the rage and the continual pursuit that they provide. Luckily, those survivors that survive those trials are then taken from the trial through the exit and eventually find themselves with no memory wipe, and in some cases getting items that they have attained from the trial as well as obtained from the entity and brought immediately to the next sub-realm that was created by the entity, which is known as the campfire. Is just that. It's a campfire in the middle that it eternally burns of a massive forest, at least that is seen throughout the distance in the darkness. The fire produces an unsettling heat and safety for the survivors, as it ensures to bring them clarity. It also brings them the ability to recoup and basically moments rest before their next trial that occurs. However, even though they're recouping and being safe from this effect, they are not at all totally safe, as in the distance they can always hear the killers or the entity's whispers. Killers are not totally known from where they're provided or sent to once it's done. The only thing that can be surmised is that the killers must be in that same campfire realm, but is not able to or forcefully unable to actually get close to the campfire, as they are only seen from a distance and never brought close enough where the survivors can actually see them in detail. Again, if a killer and such during the recoup or whatnot seems to be getting out of line, the entity ensures that it keeps in line with his wishes and its own particular method. And generally, in most cases, killers tend to enjoy this certain trial period, as it allows them to do whatever they need to do without repercussion. While once a trial begins, survivors are then teleported after providing their own offerings to the campfire by throwing it in the campfire to burn. What's also interesting to know is that the campfire itself does not actually produce any sort of bodily harm when actually being touched by a human hand or flesh, but only burn select items. And this is further outlined that this sort of mystical fire must be conjured up and created by the entity. But once the survivors are teleported, the killer is then taken to the campfire where they were once teleported so they can produce their own offerings. And this is all done by the entity in order to ensure the constant reusing and memory wiping of all the survivors and the killers and the emotional high that's produced as they're going through these trials. Ultimately, it's been noted, who provided these notes, that survivors, as they continue to go through this and continue to level up, staying in the entity realm of trials and campfires, and also as they perish with the memory wipe, as part of their soul is slowly taken away. What that really means, no one really knows, other than of course those survivors that are experiencing this method. But over time, it seems that it has an effect on their sanity and will to live. So you must wonder where all this information comes from. Obviously, us as players do not actually succumb to the world of the trials, but is all provided in documentation of the only known documents in the real life from a survivor / investigator or journalist of a sort from the world into this realm known as Benedict Baker. He caught wind of all of these missing cases and some of these rumors based on those being told from those missing from the town of Weeks, now abandoned, with tales of missing inhabitants close to the town of Weatherfield. Benedict would do his research in the library of Weatherfield while he would continue to look further and further into the town of Weeks. Eventually, it would take him to a place known as the Macmillan Estate that has been known to have nothing but the most horrible of events to occur, that it caused issues and problems in the nearby mine that it is in part of. In this particular case, once Benedict ventured to the Macmillan Estate, his actual known location of the world has gone missing, with only documents known to others in the realm of the entity, which is all being documented and identified from another character in the mix known as the Observer or the Archivist. The Observer or Archivist is able to use what is called as the Oris, which is used to probe the memories of the survivors, killers, and those that are in the fog. He loves a casual whiskey, as you've known in the videos that have been provided, and is able to live in his own area of the realm without fear or issue from the entity, at least as of now. There have been times and actual fears from him, thinking the entity may catch on to him, as I'm sure the entity has the ability to actually go into the portion of the realm and able to destroy or remove the Observer. Not much is very much known about him and where his origins are, other than the fact that he continues to stay into the entity's realm, is a prison of his own obsession, as he continues to document and probe the memories of the survivors and killers that are in the entity's realm. The entity for sure must know and aware that he seems to be there, but one can surmise that he is allowing him to stay there, as he probably continues to enjoy the memories and the documentation of loading as the entity continues the trials through. One thing that was interesting to note, though, from the Observer that continues to be provided in the Archivist's or Observer's archives is Vigo, known as an inventor or researcher, and also a survivor of the end. He's also mentioned in tome number 2 of the archive. Not only of note was he an interesting inventor or researcher, but he is also the only known one that we know so far get out of what is known as the Void, which the Void is another realm, assumed that it's created by the entity that throws its known killers and survivors that no longer have a soul or left of a will to live, as usually those are discarded just like products of the feeding that the entity requires. Not only has Vigo been the one survivor of the Void, he did it through the use of flowers that were found in the Void that no one's really documented, by creating the putrid serum that would bring him back into the entity world. Not only this though, somehow Vigo was able to create the ability of the Black Lock or hatch that is provided to the survivors randomly throughout trials. The same thing is also provided with a manifestation of these keys that unlock the Black Lock in order to help the survivor. I think the entity may or may not know of this, as it sweetens the emotional high of hope and hopelessness for survivors as well as those, but nothing can be confirmed as of yet. Vigo also, because of the fact that he's been the most well-known and probably longest survivor in the entity's realm, highlights how the entity is only seen and known when those are sacrificed through the use of the meat hooks, as well as in times randomly appearing once the entity is without any more patience and chooses to end the trial abruptly when needed. Other than these documents and what is known from the Observer and the Archivist, only known states that we know of that the entity exists, as well as the whole trials of Dead by Daylight. There have been more and more rumors of the world today of cults being created in order to actually worship or learn more and more about the entity. But one thing is very clear. The entity is known only to be his realm into the real realm through the use of old, dark, and sacred places of the woods, as well as places of emotional evil and darkness in the world of today, as he's known to grab those, revive them, that really should have perished, but has that killer potential that he seeks. Of course, the timeline and what we know of how long he's been performing these trials is very much unknown. However, the cycle of trials with the survivors and the killers going against each other as he feeds off those emotional highs of the hope and hopelessness continues to go forward. And one thing is for sure, survivors and killers alike will be eventually thrown into the Void as more and more killers and survivors from other places are brought in. And this goes in line with the actual tagline of Dead by Daylight that we all are aware of as we start the game, that death is not an escape.